I'll tell you about the first review of the book. I don't think you probably didn't see it. No. I'll send it to you. Sorry, this is an aside. I'll send it to you. It was 2 days after the book came out. The Irish Times review. So I knew the name of the person doing the review, and I felt safe enough. I was like, okay, well, she's a feminist, so it should be okay. And I didn't really think about a bad review of my book. You know what I mean? Of a memoir. It's a bit mad, but like it was a very bad review. I had to get it changed. I had to contact the editor a month later because I was in absolute paralysis for an entire month before I contacted the literary editor of the Times and said, like, she's lying about me, and got some details changed. So she said that the man who abused me, who I called Jay in the book, about like a quarter of the review was like good. My sister held it up in the cafe. We were looking at it and she was like, so this much is good and this much is bad, right? From a feminist. But she said, she called the guy Jay, who I call him Jay in the book, who abused me. She called him my first client. Yeah. So she's a feminist. She read the book in which I
16 at the time.
I was 16, but I explicitly call out the word client, and he wasn't a client. He wasn't a punter. This was before I was in the sex trade. Mm-hmm. This man was an abuser, and she said he was and she read the book. She knows that he handed me the money, and I left. In what way is that person a client? In what way am I a woman in the sex trade as a 16-year-old taking money some adult has just given me? So that made me completely... It was just it was horrific to read a woman writing that about me. And then she added in, for some reason, a really horrific detail of abuse where he made me put my knickers in the sink and run them under cold water and then put them back on. This was the first meeting. And it was awful. It was so humiliating. And she added that into a review that any random person could read about me without having to read the book to get the context or to get, it was so humiliating. And I was in bed on Saturday morning reading this on my phone, just wanting to die. Then later in the review, I can't remember it all now. It's been a while since I looked at it. It was over a year now. She gave out to me for generalizing and stuff, like, fine, whatever. I think it's so interesting because the things that were kind of true, I was like, okay, like, whatever. But it's like, fine, okay. She said that I'm vague about, I refer to sex trade advocates and I'm vague. I don't talk about who they are. And of course I'm vague because I don't want them coming for me. So I'm just calling them sex trade advocates. I'm not going to name the organizations or the people or whatever, or the pimps. So she said the sex trade advocates Mia refers to include Amnesty, the WHO, UN Women, all this. And I'm like, I wasn't referring to them. You're naming organizations that I didn't actually, you've decided who I'm talking about. Like, who do you think you are? And then she goes on about how I'm a proponent, is that a word? Somebody who supports the Nordic model, blah, 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 blah. But this was not known information. For starters, I'm sorry for ranting. I didn't mention the Nordic model once in my book. I didn't mention legislation once in my book on purpose. We've had the law now 5 years. It's not relevant. I don't need to talk about it. But she decides to make this whole 3-act drama about the Nordic model in her review and about how it's bad and blah, 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 blah. And I never once mentioned it. And I didn't mention any of these organizations. And I was just like, thanks. It's really horrific. I can't remember. It's just horrific. So I had to get things changed. I DM'd her on Twitter. I was like, what the hell is this?
And she had an axe to grind about the Nordic model and she was using your book.
I think she had... Don't think she had an axe to grind. I think she had relationships to keep safe. She's an academic. We all know how notorious academics are when it comes to the Nordic model and prostitution in general. These middle-class people who are in their, I'm so sorry for the ranting, but in their extremely sheltered, privileged position in life. Extremely sheltered. Who think that they are allowed to wax lyrical on something they will never have to experience. And it's all to keep each other happy with each other. And I think that was the vibe I got more. Was like, oh, I can't get I have to keep my feminist pals happy. It was the most horrific thing I could have read 2 days after the book coming out. It probably doesn't sound that bad now I'm saying it out loud, but it really was. It was really awful. It was really awful. And then I got it changed, and that was great. And I made a big deal out of that online. And she added in
So,
an extra like compliment on my writing. I was like, okay, great, thanks.
so for context for anyone who's not familiar with everything that's gone on in Ireland in relation to the Nordic model, could you explain just briefly what the source of conflict is over the law in Ireland and elsewhere?
Yeah, the source of conflict is you have some people and organisations who would prefer decriminalisation, which decriminalises the entire sex trade. So punters, pimping, brothel keeping, and the women in the sex trade. All of that behaviour is decriminalised. It's in New Zealand. And what we have and what we campaigned for and got in 2017 was the Nordic model, which criminalises the sale of sex and decriminalises the sale of sex and criminalises the purchase of sex. So it means the punter is committing a criminal act by paying for sex, but the woman is not doing anything illegal. And yes, some cohorts of society would prefer to keep their incomes or keep their pimping operations and would prefer decriminalisation. So that's really what was happening. It's a lot quieter now, but obviously because we've had the law for a few years. But for a few years there, it was extremely tense.
And the dominant view in academia and among most feminists is in favour of decriminalisation, and a pretty intense opposition to the Nordic model.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you say, like the writer of this review in the Irish Times is very much coming from that academic place where that's just completely standard fare, and saying anything else is really hard. I mean, I don't know what you think is motivating them. I'm sure some of it completely, as you say, is just being sheltered, just not knowing what the sex industry is like at all.
Yeah.
And I think wanting to, there's a sort of performative open-mindedness and sort of really wanting to think that selling sex is like selling anything else, and that we all just need to be more kind of just get with it.
Yeah. And they focus on, so the conversation is always around the women. It's my body, my choice. It's my right to do this. Blah, 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 blah. Fine. But we never, ever, ever look at the men who are the punters, who are the demand for the sex trade. So we hear from this tiny little minority of women who are happy out doing what they're doing, or allegedly happy out doing what they're doing, because obviously we never know what we read or see is actually true. But let's just take it at face value. Fine. We hear from these people the most, when actually in the sex trade in Ireland is 99% migrant women, and we know that over 80% of women in the sex trade want to leave the sex trade. But we have all these campaigns, nothing about us without us, and listen to sex workers and all. But it's like, which sex workers are you talking about? You're talking about yourselves. You're not talking about the 99% migrant women in Ireland. It's a really individualistic, selfish, all about me, liberal feminist, hard energy kind of a thing. As opposed to, what do we want the world to look like? What do we want for all women? What's best for all women and all girls? Obviously, paid sex is not that, obviously. So let's work towards that rather than keeping you happy because you get to pick your clients. It's absurd to me that people buy into this bullshit, but I do think it's because people, and I'm talking about average people, everyday people, they don't want to see the actual darkness that's in the dark heart of misogyny that is prostitution. And that is why I go on and on about the men so much and the reviews they leave for the women, and the fact there's 100,000 of them in Ireland compared to around 1,000 women in the sex trade in Ireland. But our awareness is always on the women. So I keep wanting to drag it back onto the men and be like, if you're saying the sex trade is okay, it's a job like any other, then you have to say that this behaviour of these men is okay, that them doing this is okay, that them leaving these reviews and giving ratings out of 5 stars for appearance, satisfaction, overall, value for money. Oh, it's absolutely horrific. And they write things like she had no English. She could only say things that were like business related terms. She's very
The
tight.
euphemisms are just awful, aren't they?
Yeah, the starter was good. The main course was okay. Like these weird language, but saying that a woman had great tits and is very tight. And liberal feminists are defending this by defending the sex trade. And most of them don't know that reviews exist. Most of them haven't been on the Escort Ireland website or Punternet or whatever. Most of them wouldn't go there. But they can sit around on Twitter or whatever they want to do talking about how sex workers work. I'm sorry.
Yeah. The thing that makes me feel really sure that actually they do know that it's not like selling other things, that, reviewing.
They know it's not like other things.
Yeah, and the thing that I think makes it really obvious to me is that they are they tend to be the first to kick up a fuss about sexual harassment in their own workplaces. You saw this during Me Too, where, say, journalists who were super pro sex workers' work, decrim, etc., would then be sort of hypersensitive to sexual jokes or like even non-sexual touching or all kinds of stuff in their own, their offices, which had any kind of sexual flavour, and would say, this is really inappropriate, this makes women uncomfortable. Like, when it's them, they get it. But then when it comes to, some other like hypothetical woman having to sort of sell sexual access to herself, then suddenly that's okay. I mean, this is, I think, the problem with trying to say that sex is just a service or can be comparable to anything else, is that if you're saying that, then you also have to say that sexual harassment isn't worse than any other kind of sort of rudeness in the office.
Yeah.
That rape is just like theft, that, you have to go the whole way. And they don't go the whole way, which makes me think that they don't really mean it. And actually almost no one really means it, I think.
Yeah, I don't think they mean it either. I think they're just, it's like a cognitive distortion of some kind, so they don't have to actually face into stuff. If they keep telling lies, then they're kind of weirdly protected in some way. But you're so right when they talk about sexual harassment and this kind of thing. It's like either our sexuality has, and Andrea Hines, a sex trade survivor, said this recently, either sexuality has an innate value or it doesn't. You don't get to pick and choose when it does and when it doesn't. And actually our bodies don't get to pick and choose when it does or when it doesn't. So when we say, this is why I get so angry with the word consent. If I say, yes, I will give you a blowjob for 50 quid, that's me consenting to do that. But my body is experiencing an unwanted sexual experience. Whether I'm thinking, this is fine, it'll be over in half an hour, I'm getting 50 quid or whatever it is. This is worth it for the money, blah, 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 all this stuff I used to tell myself. The body is absorbing the unwanted sex, so it's absorbing the trauma, and we're compounding down on that freeze response that I got from when I was raped. And from before then, in other experiences in life, that would have sent the message, you can't say no, or whatever. That's why the sex trade is harmful. That's why. Because the body, taking away anybody's individualistic thoughts and feelings about the sex trade or how much they like it, or if they get off on having sex for money, whatever it is, the body experiences unwanted sex, and we can't argue with that. There's no arguing that. And it'll come out in various different ways. But most of us live in our heads, not in our bodies. So we intellectualize everything. It keeps us away from the visceral reality. And especially men really drive me nuts when they're protecting the sex trade. I'm like, imagine if they went into a hotel room and their own 21-year-old daughter was sitting on the bed. What would they feel? They'd be absolutely appalled. And we all know they would be. We all know that visceral response we have when we think about having sex with a random stranger. Because that's what the sex trade is. They don't talk about they. I say they. I'm doing that generalizing thing again. But you know what I'm talking about. These advocates of the sex trade. They say they will never talk about what actually happens in the room. So a man comes in. He speaks to you or he doesn't speak to you. Or you go into his room. He lets you in. He's either friendly, not friendly. He makes small talk. He doesn't. You don't know. You just have to go along with whatever. And then he takes out his dick and you have to give him a blowjob. That's what happens. There is no having a nice time or anything like that. Anything they might allude to or talk about how lovely their punters are and all this kind of stuff. The everyday reality of the sex trade is that a man comes in, you give him a blowjob, then you have sex with him and he leaves. And that's it. And a lot of them don't speak at all for the entire time you're with them, which is extremely disconcerting at best, I suppose. But yeah, no, they fully know it's not just a service like any other. And that argument is so demeaning and degrading because you're making abuse less than what it is. You're minimizing and sweeping away actual real abuse that happens to women and girls around the country every single day.